All of the talks I do have a common theme, that our trusted leaders cannot be trusted. Constant repetition of anything can of course become dull and tiresome at best, and at worst counterproductive. So if you've seen any of my previous films, I should begin by pointing out that the theme of this one is pretty much the same as the others. However, the particular area that I want to focus on today is the vitally important subject of history. And I hope to show how most of our conditioning to trust the people we really should not be trusting at all is largely down to the way the subject of history is taught. Our brainwashing begins almost as soon as we're born. It isn't carried out by sinister men in thick lens spectacles and white lab coats, but by those we instinctively trust the most, our own families. Parents, grandparents, uncles and aunts, older brothers and sisters. As we get a little older, the ring of people we instinctively trust widens out to include non-family members, such as friends, priests and school teachers. Later on, it starts to include others, such as newsreaders and bosses at work. For the most part, none of these people intend us any harm. At worst, they sometimes have a little harmless joke at our expense. Nevertheless, they do begin the process of making us conform and submit to the will of the rich and powerful. Most of those who condition us like this do it without even knowing they're doing it, because they've already been programmed and brainwashed themselves, and are merely doing what their conditioning has trained them to do. No doubt most people would squirm a little bit at those words. They need not do so. I'm not getting at them, and I don't mean them as a criticism of those nearest and dearest to us. Indeed, it's almost impossible for people not to be brainwashed, through no fault of their own, or those who do the brainwashing for that matter. It's just the way our society is managed, how it's always been managed. Proof, I hear you cry, and rightly so. Well, consider this. How many children do you know who are not brought up believing in fantasies? How many small children do not learn and believe in fairy stories, fables, and legends of one kind or another? Tales of dragons and demons, witches and wizards, talking animals, ghosts, and other assorted imaginary entities, both good and bad. How many children are not conditioned to believe in Father Christmas, Easter bunnies, tooth fairies, and so on? Of course, we all learn the truth about these childish fictions at quite an early age, but that doesn't alter the fact that for the first couple of years of our lives, much of our growing brains are filled with illusion, fantasy, and lies. These early days of discovery actually provide an opportunity to learn a vitally important lesson, but very few of us do learn it because it's seldom taught. Some of us never learn that vital lesson at all, and that lesson is this: never believe anything unless it can be proven with hard facts and evidence. And even then, allow some room for doubt that the facts and evidence might prove to be wrong. Coupled to that vital lesson should be another vital lesson. It's an incredibly simple and ancient rule that's been taught in one form or another in so-called primitive societies all around the world, but which is seriously neglected in our modern and supposedly advanced society. Known as the Golden Rule, it says we should treat all living things with care and respect, as we ourselves would want to be treated in the same circumstances. Armed with the Golden Rule and the desire and ability to seek out the truth in all things, our early basic education would be complete. But this is not how small children are taught. They're taught instead about lies and fantasies, and to accept unbelievable cruelty as normal and acceptable. And sometimes even that cruelty is somehow good. When I was young, for example, the saying, "spare the rod and spoil the child," was commonly known and practiced. And even today, we still hear another well-known saying, "you have to be cruel to be kind." When we eventually discover the truth about the childish lies we're all routinely taught from the moment of birth, our enlightenment is simply dismissed with knowing secretive smiles, quietly acknowledging our transition from infancy to childhood. Our sudden understanding of the non-existence of fairy tale worlds is rewarded with recruitment, acceptance into the wise world of adults, by being trusted not to spill the beans, so that we too will continue to peddle the same old nonsense to our younger brothers and sisters, and any other small child we may encounter for the rest of our lives. Hence the ritual appearance, year in and year out, of Father Christmas, for example. Billions of adults routinely perpetuating a known lie to small children. A supposedly harmless and kindly meant lie, but a lie nonetheless, whose ultimate purpose is to serve big business. Because those vital first lessons are not taught, because we don't learn to demand hard evidence for everything we're expected to believe, and to examine everything through the lens of the Golden Rule, we continue to swallow lies and to meekly accept unbelievable cruelties as completely normal. As we grow older, the lies become far more serious. Unlike the fairy stories we learn as small children from people who know the fairy stories aren't true, the lies we're conditioned to believe as older children and adults are taught to us by people who also really believe the lies themselves. The most obvious example of this is religion. As I've already done a whole talk on this subject, I won't repeat it, but the key point cannot be made too often. Religion, all religion, is no more than grown-up fairy stories. But these fairy stories are infinitely more dangerous than their childish equivalents. No one usually sustains any physical harm from the fairy tales told to small children, but that is most definitely not the case about the fantasies told in the name of religion, because in the whole sweep of human history, many billions of people have suffered very grievously in the name of religion, and they continue to suffer very grievously today in their hundreds of millions. This hard, undeniable fact about religion is arguably the most single important lesson to take from this talk, because if so many people can be so easily misled by such obvious fantasy, how many others are being misled by less obvious fantasies? And what are those fantasies? This talk focuses on another group of fairy tales and fantasies which are commonly taught to nearly all school children as truth, and which remain masquerading as truth in the minds of those children for the rest of their lives. This group of fairy tales and fantasies is called history. This is not to say that history per se is fantasy, obviously, simply that the way history is packaged and taught to young children and adults alike is every bit as misleading and deceitful as the other fairy stories they learn from the cradle to the church. It's said that the truth, carefully crafted, is the biggest lie of all. Those words lie at the very heart of a subject I'll be going into in some depth in the very near future, the media. But they're equally true and every bit as valid for this talk too, so I'll repeat them. The truth, carefully crafted, is the biggest lie of all. The subject of history perfectly illustrates this, because the history we learn as young people at school, and which we automatically assume as the truth, because our trusted teachers would never knowingly lie to us, is at best only ever half true. And the truths that are omitted in this process are usually vitally important. The trick is accomplished by using a mixture of real truth, such as the date certain events took place, for example, together with a range of information whose authenticity is far less certain, as well as the complete omission of the effect those events had on the ordinary people who suffered as a consequence. And most of the significant events in human history include very considerable human suffering, most of which is entirely omitted from schoolroom history lessons. It's well known that history is written by the winners. In other words, everything from wars to changes of ruler to voyages of exploration to technological improvements are taught in schools as good things, great things even. What's never taught in any meaningful way is the consequences of those events upon the lives of billions of ordinary people. Take, for example, the so-called Age of Exploration, that period of time that ran roughly from the 15th to the 19th century, when most of the powerful European nations sent powerful armies all around the world, claiming the territories of distant lands as the personal property of European kings and queens who never even knew such places existed. Most of the European countries did this: Portugal, Spain, France, Britain, and the Netherlands all sent armies to colonize vast swathes of the globe, murdering and enslaving native populations and stealing the natural resources of those lands, the gold and silver, silks and cottons, herbs and spices, and so on. These hundreds of years of relentless plunder and untold human misery for so many millions of people are sold to schoolchildren as the great heroic achievements of their country's early leaders. How these supposedly great leaders somehow benefited the people they enslaved, robbed, and slaughtered. The Church is never very far away from these history lessons. We learn how priests accompanied these mighty armies to help civilize hordes of heathen barbarians, so that even their souls would not remain their own. So in this example of the Age of Exploration, we have some details that are almost certainly true, such as the dates particular events took place, and the names of some of the key individuals who were involved. And that's about it as far as hard truth is concerned. Because once we start learning about the actual events themselves, the truth quickly becomes murky or disappears altogether. Whether we're talking about the Dutch invasion of the Far East, or the Spanish invasion of the Americas, or the British invasion of India or Africa, the history lessons that were taught to British, Dutch and Spanish children about these infamous adventures taught also about the courage of the mighty European soldiers fighting heroic wars against vast armies of murderous heathen barbarians, and of the enlightened imperial rulers who graciously brought wisdom, civilization and the Christian Bible to poor savage natives. But the real truth was, of course, very different.